Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to learn how to play the 2 to 4 player game Runestones, being released by Queen Games. Runestones comes with all of the components that you see here, including one game board, 20 ore pieces, 75 gems in 5 different colors, 68 creature cards, player decks in one of 4 different colors, overview cards, 24 total runestones, 4 player boards, a first player marker, 1 throne, a die, and 28 artifact tiles. To begin setup, place the game board in the middle of the table. Then place all of the gems, including the clear gems, in the middle of the board along with the iron ore pieces as a general supply. Place the throne piece near the 65 point marker on the points track, and make sure and keep the die next to the game board as well. Then sort all of the runestones by their front symbols. Place runestones onto these indicated spaces of the game board. The number of each runestone placed is 1 fewer than the player count. So in our 2-player example, 1 of each runestone will be placed on the indicated spaces. Next, stack all of the wild white artifacts onto the wild smithy space of the board. The wild smithy space has 4 multicolored gem symbols. Shuffle the rest of the artifacts face down and place them in stacks as a supply next to the game board. After doing this, randomly draw artifacts and fill each smithy space on the game board. Each player will then take a player board, an overview card, the set of druid cards that matches their character, and a scoring marker that matches their character's symbol and color as well. Each player will also receive 1 gem of each color, including the clear wild gems. Each player will place their player board and overview card in front of them, and then shuffle their druid deck and form a draw pile face down on the left side of their player board. Players will draw 4 cards as their starting hand, and then place their score markers on the starting space of the game board. Next, shuffle the creature card deck and place them in a face-down stack on the indicated space of the game board. Then fill in the 6 spaces of the game board with creature cards. It's important to note that if any dragon cards are revealed during setup, set that card aside and then replace it with another card from the deck. After doing this, shuffle the dragon card back into the supply. Finally, randomly determine a start player and place the indicated start player marker next to their player board. After all of this has been done, you're ready to play the game. Runestones is played over a series of game rounds, beginning with the first player, and then following in a clockwise direction. Each player will choose one of 3 possible actions to take on their turn. They can either summon creatures. This involves purchasing cards from the display by paying their indicated magic point cost, and then placing the purchased cards on their discard pile. They can utilize abilities, which involves playing 2 cards from their hand and then using the abilities of the cards listed on the side of the card. Or they can forge artifacts, which involves returning colored gems to the supply that match the color of the artifact the player wishes to forge. After each action that a player takes, they have the option of exchanging artifacts from their rows of power for points and 1 runestone. After completing one of the actions and potentially exchanging artifacts, the player would refill their hand to 4 cards if they've used any cards, and then it's the next player's turn. Now that we've looked at the general overview of the game and of a player's turn, let's look at each action that a player can take in detail. The first action that a player can take on their turn is to summon creatures. To summon creatures, players will use the magic points printed on their cards to summon creatures from the display. The cost to purchase cards from the display is shown below the card. So for instance, this blue card on the far left would cost 4 magic points, while the card on the far right would only cost 1 magic point. The players are allowed to discard as many magic points from their hand of the same color as they wish. It's important to note that multicolored magic cards are wild and can be combined with any other color. So for instance, this player could either discard this blue, green, or red card for 2 magic points. If they wanted to, they could also combine this multicolored energy to any one of these colors for 3 total points. The cards are discarded to the right of the player's player board. And let's say that this player decided to discard these 2 cards for 3 total magic points, 2 blue and a 3rd wild magic point. After a player has discarded cards to gain magic points, They can use these magic points to summon as many creatures from the display as they're able to pay for. So in this example, the player could buy either of the cards costing 3 magic points. They could buy one of the cards costing 2 and the card costing 1 magic point, or any combination of these types of cards. The remaining cards in the display would be moved to the right to fill in the gap, and new cards would be drawn from the top of the deck to fill in the gaps on the left. The players would place their newly summoned cards onto their discard pile. The next action that a player can take on their turn is the Utilize ability action. To complete this action, the player takes 2 cards from their hand and plays them face up. They have to play 2 cards. They're not allowed to only play 1. The player is then able to resolve the abilities of each card in any order that they wish. It's important to note that if a player doesn't want to perform a certain ability, or if they're not able to, that ability is simply wasted. After playing the cards and resolving their abilities, the card played with the higher number is removed from the player's deck. If the higher numbered card is a creature card purchased from the display, which is also indicated by this symbol at the top of the card is removed from the player's deck and placed in the general discard pile of the displayed cards. If the higher valued card is one of the player's starting druid cards, also indicated by their player symbol at the top of the card, then this card is removed from the game after the player resolves the card's abilities. There are 3 different categories of abilities that players can utilize when taking the Utilize Abilities action. When this card is played, it simply gives the player 2 points. When this card is played, the player gets to roll the bonus die. The die can give players a number of different rewards, including a number of victory points, allowing the player to draw the top card from the general draw pile and add it to their discard pile, giving the player 1 ore piece, allowing them to choose any color gem from the supply, or allowing them to swap any color of gem for a wild gem. This card allows a player to gain any color gem from the supply. This card allows a player to gain 2 yellow gems from the supply, and this card allows a player to gain a piece of ore from the supply. There are also cards that will give multiple abilities and allow players to gain cards from the display. For instance, this card allows a player to gain any available face-up yellow card from the display, in addition to giving them 1 yellow gem from the supply. This card will allow a player to gain any available green card from the display and give them 1 gem that's green from the supply as well. This card would allow a player to gain 1 card from the display of any color and then gain 1 ore piece. There are also cards that give people optional abilities. For instance, all of these cards allow a player to choose one option or the other. They can't choose both unless a special ability says otherwise. And finally, there are cards that allow players to swap certain goods for other goods or victory points. For instance, this card allows a player to swap 1 yellow gem for 2 wild gems from the supply. This card would allow a player to swap 2 red gems for 3 victory points. The third action a player could take on their turn is to forge artifacts. A player has an ability to forge up to 2 artifacts, but they have to come from 2 different smithies. To forge an artifact, the player has to pay the indicated number of gems in the matching artifact color to the supply. So for instance, to purchase this blue artifact, a player could return these 3 blue gems to the supply. They would then be able to take the blue artifact and place it on either one of the blue spaces in one of their rows of power. If there's no space available, if there's no matching space available, a player can't forge an artifact of that color. And it's important to note that once an artifact is placed, it can't be moved. If a player wanted to, as their second artifact, they could purchase this one here. The players only have 2 gems in the matching color, but they do have a wild white gem. It's important to note that when purchasing artifacts, wild gems can be substituted for any color. It's also important to note that if players forge an artifact from one of these indicated spaces that show a bonus above the artifact, they immediately gain that bonus when forging an artifact from this smithy. So for instance, after forging this blue artifact here, the player would get to roll the die and gain the indicated reward. After forging this artifact, the player would gain 1 ore piece, and after forging this artifact, the player would gain 3 victory points. It's also important to note that players are able to forge this wild white artifact if they wish. To do this, a player can spend 4 gems of any color. And once again, since players have to forge artifacts from different smithies, only 1 wild artifact can be forged per turn. But let's say, for instance, that this player decided to turn in these 4 gems and forge a wild artifact. When placing a wild artifact onto one of the rows of power, It can either be placed on the wild space or on any other space that the player wants. So for instance, this player could place this artifact here, or if they wanted to, they could place it on one of these other spaces, because wild artifacts can be placed anywhere as long as there's an open space. It's also important to note that if a player wants to, instead of paying the indicated gem cost at any one of the smithies, a player can always discard 3 ore pieces to gain any of the artifacts from any one of the smithies. It's important to note that if a player gains an artifact this way instead of spending the gems, they don't gain any potential bonuses associated with a smithy from which they forge. After a player has finished the forging action, they'll draw an artifact from one of the face-down artifact stacks to refill any empty spaces in the smithies. It's important to note that if this stack of face-down artifacts ever runs out, players will shuffle the face-up discard pile of artifacts and use them as a new draw pile. Before their turn is over, regardless of which action a player chose, they always have the opportunity before their action is done to exchange their artifacts for power points and a runestone if available. The player can decide for each one of their power rows if they want to discard all of the artifacts from that row to gain points and 1 runestone from the display. A player has to have at least 2 artifacts in their power row to do this, and the number of points gained by taking this bonus depends on how many artifacts are discarded. You can see a reference at the bottom of each player board showing how many points are gained for the different number of artifacts returned. If a player returns 2 artifacts, they gain 3 points. If a player returns 3 artifacts, they gain 6. 4 artifacts, they gain 10, and 5 artifacts, they gain 15 points. So for instance, if they wanted to, this player could return these 3 artifacts from this power row to the discard pile, which would allow them to gain 6 victory points. After doing this, the player would then be able to choose one of the face-up runestones and place it in one of the indicated indentations of their player board. This runestone would give the player an ongoing benefit that only they would gain. We'll go over what each runestone does for a player at the end of the video. It's important to note that a player isn't able to take a runestone that they already own, and if a player owns 4 runestones when they exchange artifacts, this would mean that their player board is full, and they only gain points when taking this action, not another runestone. If a player wanted to, for this second row of power, they could also return these 2 artifacts, gaining points and another runestone, or they could save these artifacts for a later turn. After a player has taken one of the 3 possible actions on their turn, and then exchanged artifacts from their rows of power if they want to, the last step of a player's turn is to refill their hand to their hand limit. After refilling their hand by drawing cards from their draw pile, play would pass to the next player. Play will continue this way until one player has reached or passed 65 points. The round will be finished, meaning that each player will take the same number of turns. Play will then end, and then the players will continue to final scoring. In addition to their points on the track, players will now gain additional victory points for the following. They'll gain 1 point for every 3 pieces of gem or pieces of ore in their supply. So for instance, for these 6 gems and ore, this player would gain 2 additional points. And then for any artifacts remaining in their rows of power, players would gain the same number of victory points as they would from returning these artifacts during the game. So for instance, for these 3 artifacts, this player would gain an additional 6 victory points at game's end. After this, the player with the most points is the winner and ascends to the Throne of Druids. If there's a tie for the most points, the players will share the victory. Now that we've learned how to play the game, let's look at the special abilities of the Runestones. This runestone gives players additional magic points when they're taking the summon creature's action. So in addition to any magic points gained by discarding cards for cards in the display, this player also gains 2 magic points that are wild and can be added to any color. This runestone allows a player to increase their maximum hand size to 6 instead of 4, so when refilling their hand they draw up to 6 cards. This runestone allows players to exchange once during their turn. One time during their turn, a player can swap one of their gems of any color for one ore, or they can swap one ore from their supply for one gem from the general supply. It's important to note that when making this exchange, the player cannot swap ore for a wild gem. This runestone would allow players to gain an extra power point. When utilizing abilities that give power points, the player would gain an extra point for each card. So for instance, if utilizing this card's ability, the player would gain 4 points instead of 3. This runestone would allow players to gain the benefit of the die twice. So if a player has this runestone, instead of gaining 2 points for this die face, they would gain 4. And instead of gaining 1 ore piece, they would gain 2, and each side of the die would be resolved in this way. If players have this runestone, they're able to utilize 3 abilities when they take the Utilize Abilities action. If they want to, the player can choose to play 3 cards instead of 2, using all of the card's abilities in any order that they like. If they do this, the lowest valued card is placed in their discard pile like normal, but instead of getting rid of only the highest valued card, the player would get rid of the 2 highest valued cards from the 3 that they play. Since these 2 cards are both Druid cards, they would both be removed from the game after utilizing their abilities. If a player gains this runestone, they would immediately place one of the gems from the general supply onto this runestone. It can't be a wild gem. It's important to note that it's up to the player to decide when they do this. But once placed, the gem stays in place and can't be removed for the rest of the game. And all of that player's gems of that color are considered wild gems for the rest of the game. So in this example, this player can play green gems as if they're wild, in addition to the normal white wild gems. And finally, this runestone allows players to gain both benefits of an either-or card when taking the Utilize Abilities action. So for instance, instead of having to choose a blue or a green gem, if a player has this runestone, they gain both rewards when playing this card. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thedicey@gmail.com. If you want to hear more from the Dicey Review, you can check out our Dicey Review podcast. It can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, pretty much any podcasting app. You can read our written reviews at thediceyreview.com and make sure and connect with us on social media or at our Board Game Geek Guild. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.